Honor was the lifeblood of her people, the currency of survival, the breath that carried them from cradle to grave. Victory was sacred. Defeat meant death. There were no compromises, no gray lines, only absolutes written into the marrow of their bones. And in this moment, all eyes turned toward the daughter of the royal line, the warrior princess sworn to uphold those ancient codes. She had been taught since childhood that her blade was her soul, and today she would prove it in blood. Her name carried weight, whispered with reverence in the citadels of her empire. She had trained under masters who had never lost a duel, studied forms perfected through centuries, and sharpened her body into a weapon sculpted for conquest. Confidence had always walked beside her like a shadow. Humans, she believed, were fragile, soft creatures of chaos, unworthy of the battlefield. But today she faced one, and the Empire demanded that she demonstrate their superiority. The thought filled her with an almost arrogant calm. Her opponent was unlike any she had faced. He stood with quiet composure, broad-shouldered, scarred, silent. The crowd hurled insults at him, expecting fear, perhaps defiance. Instead, he stood still, his gaze steady, his breathing measured. No wasted movement, no posturing to rattle her. He looked through her as though she were simply another obstacle, another problem to solve. That unnerved her more than any weapon he carried. For all her training, she had never met an opponent who emanated such calm indifference. Stories had spread about him long before this day. A human warrior captured in distant campaigns, thrown into the pits again and again, never tasting defeat. He had no need for theatrics, his record spoke for him. In the silence of his stare, she felt something unspoken. He was a predator who had endured and survived more than she could imagine. For the first time in her life, doubt slipped into her heart like a splinter. She buried it quickly, refusing to let it grow. This duel was not hers alone. Her father's court watched from the highest balcony, judges of her every strike. The nobles filled the terraces, eager to see the human broken, his blood a testament to their unchallenged dominion. Her honor was entwined with theirs, and failure would stain her family's name. Death was acceptable. Submission was not. In her world, living after defeat was a shame greater than annihilation. Her pride demanded that she win, and her duty to her lineage burned hotter than the sun overhead. Yet the human did not carry the weight of pomp or pride. He carried only himself, as though survival had become his sole creed. His scars told stories of battles without audience, victories earned in silence. Where she had trained in courts, he had fought in mud and blood. Where she had learned tradition, he had learned necessity. The longer she studied him, the more she felt the edges of her confidence erode. The rules were simple. One would live, one would die. Weapons were chosen according to custom, and as she held her blade, the steel shimmered with ceremonial engravings, blessings etched into its edge. His weapon bore no artistry, no divine symbols. It was plain, functional, lethal. He held it with a casual grip that spoke louder than ceremony ever could. The crowd roared with anticipation, voices chanting her name, promising her victory before the battle even began. Their faith was a double-edged sword, bolstering her pride while chaining her to expectation. She inhaled, exhaled, and tried to quiet the storm inside her chest. He remained silent, watching, waiting, studying her as though cataloging her weaknesses before a single strike had been made. This was not the way of her people. A duel was meant to be a clash of honor, not a cold assessment. But the human seemed carved from another philosophy altogether. His presence was oppressive not because he threatened with words or gestures, but because he wasted nothing. His silence was heavier than her people's chants, his calm stronger than their frenzy. She thought of her ancestors, the long line of warriors who had never bent, who had died with pride unbroken. She imagined their eyes upon her now, demanding that she uphold their legacy. She raised her blade higher, and the engravings caught the light like fire. Her voice rang out, declaring her readiness, and the crowd erupted with renewed fury. She did not glance at her opponent, but she felt his gaze pierce her, steady as stone. For the human, this was not about honor. It was about survival, about dominance, about showing that no cage could strip him of strength. She sensed it instinctively. Where she sought glory, he sought victory. Where she needed validation, he needed only the simplicity of being alive at the end of the fight. That difference, subtle yet profound, whispered to her that she had stepped onto unfamiliar ground. Every duel had its rhythm, a pulse of fear and anticipation. She felt it now, pounding in her veins, quickening her breath. The air tasted of iron, sweat, and expectation. The dust beneath her feet seemed to cling to her skin, as though the arena itself conspired to remind her of the weight of this trial. Across from her, he had not shifted an inch. The signal was near. She tightened her grip, silenced the noise in her head, and steeled herself. This duel was more than a contest of blades. It was a crucible, a test of philosophies, a clash of two worlds colliding beneath the watch of thousands. She would carve his defeat into legend, or he would carve hers into silence. Either way, the blood spilled today would echo far beyond the walls of the arena. And as the final breath of calm swept over her before the storm, she realized with a chill that she wanted not only to defeat him, but to understand him. That dangerous thought lingered as the moment of reckoning arrived. The signal struck like thunder, and in an instant steel sang against steel. She lunged first, quick as lightning, her blade arcing in a perfect strike honed by years of discipline. He met it with fluid ease, a single movement that absorbed her force and redirected it. The sound cracked through the arena, and the crowd roared, but he did not flinch. His counter came sharp, simple, designed not for display but for survival. She barely slipped aside, her breath caught by the realization that his precision was not luck. Again she pressed forward, weaving through her people's sacred forms, every strike a pattern drilled into her muscles since childhood. He unraveled them as though he had seen them before, parrying, sidestepping, striking in ways that seemed to bend logic. Where she moved with rhythm, he moved with disruption. He never gave her the sequence she sought, never allowed the cadence to settle. His style was not a style, it was refusal to be predictable. Sweat began to sting her brow. She realized how much energy she had already spent in only a few exchanges. He did not waste movement. Every strike he threw served a purpose, every block an economy of force. She fought with artistry, with the weight of tradition. He fought like a man who had bled through endless battles with no audience to applaud him. Survival had sharpened him beyond technique. The crowd shouted her name, urging her to finish him, but their voices blurred into meaningless noise. Her arms ached under the steady weight of his blows. He was stronger than she had expected, not with the brute force of beasts but with the hard-earned resilience of one who had fought too many times to count. She had trained in luxury, he had trained in suffering, and that made every movement of his cut deeper than her pride could endure. She feinted, spun, and drove her blade in a strike that would have ended any lesser opponent. He caught it, twisted, and forced her off balance. Her knees buckled for a heartbeat, and that single moment of weakness sent a shiver down her spine. He could have ended it there. Instead, he let her recover, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no malice in them, only a brutal clarity. "You fight with pride, not purpose," he said, his first word since the battle began. His voice was steady, calm, cutting deeper than any blade. She snarled, denying the sting of truth, but her chest tightened. Her people had taught her that pride was purpose, that honor was survival. Yet here stood a human who treated those beliefs as chains, who fought not for reputation but for existence. She attacked again, reckless now, driven by the need to silence the doubt gnawing at her. He answered with efficiency, dismantling her flurry until her weapon slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the dust. Gasps erupted from the terraces. Her heart hammered as she fell back, unarmed, staring up at the figure towering above her. He stood over her, his blade at her throat, steady and unshaking. The crowd fell into a silence, so deep it was deafening. She braced herself for the end. Death was the only acceptable outcome. To die by his hand would at least preserve her honor. Her people would remember her as one who fell without bending. That was what she told herself as she lifted her chin, baring her throat for the strike. But the blade did not move. His eyes locked on hers, unyielding, searching, as though weighing something far greater than the duel itself. Time stretched painfully. The silence became unbearable, every second a humiliation. Why did he hesitate? Why did he not finish it? The crowd shifted in restless confusion, expecting blood, demanding it. Yet he remained still. Her chest rose and fell in sharp breaths. She was ready for the sting of steel, but instead he lowered his blade, not in mercy, but in command. He had beaten her utterly, and yet he denied her the release of death. The weight of that choice pressed down heavier than any strike he had landed. She realized with sudden clarity that in sparing her, he was doing something far worse than killing. He was claiming her defeat as his to shape. Whispers spread through the arena. Nobles muttered in outrage. Elders frowned in confusion. Her people understood death, but not this. She was humiliated, her honor shattered, yet she lived. And in that moment, she saw the truth of his power. Victory for him was not measured by blood spilled, but by control. He had taken everything from her and still withheld the final blow, turning her from warrior to captive without shackles. The princess trembled with fury and shame. She wanted to scream, to demand that he end her. But his eyes silenced her, commanding obedience without words. The air itself seemed to bend under the force of his will. He had proven himself stronger not just with the blade but with the mind, reshaping the very rules of their duel into something alien, something undeniably human. The signal that had begun the fight no longer mattered. The battle had ended, but no one in the arena knew how to name its conclusion. She had been defeated, not destroyed, and that was a punishment far sharper than death. She remained on the ground, trembling not with fear but with the unbearable knowledge that her life now belonged to the man who had refused to kill her. And as he turned from her, leaving the silence of his victory to hang heavy over the crowd, she felt the foundations of her world shift beneath her feet. Death had been denied her, but something far more dangerous had taken its place. The crowd waited for the execution stroke that never came, their chants dissolving into a confused murmur. She remained on her knees, her breath ragged, staring at the man who had undone her world with nothing more than restraint. To live after such defeat was an abomination in her culture. Her chest burned with humiliation, yet beneath that fire pulsed a sharper fear. What did it mean if he refused to end her? What claim would he make instead? He stood above her, blade lowered, his voice steady. Death is too simple. I will not give you that release. The words struck harder than any weapon. Death had been her expectation, her right. To be denied it was to be stripped of everything she thought she understood. The silence of the arena tightened around her throat as she struggled to comprehend. Her people had no word for mercy. What he offered was not mercy, it was domination. He had shattered the ancient covenant of victory and death and replaced it with something far worse, survival on his terms. She wanted to resist, to spit in his face, to demand the fatal strike. But his eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, and she felt her will waver under the weight of his authority. Her heart hammered with conflict. Pride screamed for death, yet instinct whispered for life. For the first time, survival outweighed honor, though admitting it clawed at her soul. She thought of her father, watching from his high seat, and felt the shame crash over her. To surrender was to defile her lineage, to desecrate every tradition she had been raised to defend. Yet the human's presence left her with no other path. The crowd roared in disbelief as she bent her head. It was not the gesture of a warrior, but of one who yielded. Gasps rippled through the terraces. Never in living memory had a princess of her house bowed to an enemy, let alone a human. The sound of her submission spread like a crack through stone, splitting centuries of unbroken pride. She expected him to strike her down in that moment, to claim her weakness as justification. But instead, he sheathed his weapon and placed his hand upon her shoulder, forcing her deeper into her humiliation. The bargain had been sealed without words. Her life was spared, but the cost was unbearable. She would surrender her body to him, not as a gift but as tribute, a currency of power exchanged in front of her people. The weight of that knowledge settled over her like chains. Death would have been clean. This was endless. Eyes bore into her from every direction, elders whispering of disgrace, warriors clenching their fists, nobles muttering in outrage. Some spat curses, others fell silent, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. To them, she was no longer the unbroken daughter of their empire, but a living symbol of shame. Yet in the core of her being, buried beneath layers of humiliation, another feeling stirred: confusion, curiosity, something she dared not name. The human did not gloat. He did not raise his arms to the crowd or bathe in their disbelief. His calm remained unbroken, his composure frighteningly intact. That quiet restraint unsettled her more than triumph ever could. He had undone her without spectacle, and that made his victory absolute. He had not only claimed her body but rewritten her fate, forcing her to carry the burden of submission in a culture that had no place for it. As they left the arena, her steps faltered under the weight of eyes that would never forget. Her father's gaze cut into her, filled not with sorrow but with contempt. He would have preferred her corpse to this walking disgrace. She wished he had ordered her death then and there, yet he remained silent, bound by the spectacle that had unfolded. To intervene would have been to admit that the human had reshaped the rules before all to see. Inwardly she raged, her pride clawing for escape, yet she could not erase the truth. He had spared her not out of kindness, but to prove a point: that survival was greater than pride, that power was not in the blade, but in the will to bend another without killing them. And deep within, beneath the fire of shame, a dangerous thought lingered. Perhaps he had shown her something her people had forgotten. That thought was poison, but it took root. Each breath reminded her of the humiliation, yet also of the strength in his refusal to follow her rules. For the first time, she doubted the sanctity of the traditions she had been sworn to protect. She despised herself for it, yet she could not banish the seed he had planted. The whispers of the crowd grew into rumors that spread beyond the arena walls. Some said the human had bewitched her, others that she had betrayed her people willingly. None understood the truth, that he had shattered her certainty with nothing but restraint. She carried that truth like a scar deeper than flesh, one that no healing could erase. In the solitude of her chambers, the silence pressed harder than the roar of the crowd. She touched the hilt of the ceremonial blade that had slipped from her grasp, once the symbol of her pride. Now it felt like an ornament, empty, meaningless. Her honor had been stolen, yet her life remained, tethered to the man who had refused to end it. She knew what was expected: suicide to cleanse the shame. But his command still rang in her ears. He had given her life not as a gift, but as an order. And for reasons she could not name, she obeyed. The thought that her fate was no longer hers to command was unbearable, yet she felt a strange gravity pulling her toward it, as if survival under his shadow was more intoxicating than the release of death. Her body trembled as she realized the full scope of her submission. She had surrendered not only in the arena, but in the deepest laws of her people. And yet, against every truth she had ever known, she lived. That contradiction gnawed at her soul, a wound deeper than any blade could carve. In the stillness that followed her defeat, she sat alone with the weight of 1,000 stares still burning in memory. Survival had never been meant for her. To live after yielding was worse than death, yet she could not erase the fact that her heart still beat because he had willed it so. Her pride screamed for release, but every time she thought of raising the blade against herself, she remembered the way his eyes had held her, commanding obedience more strongly than chains ever could. When he entered, the silence of the chamber seemed to bend around him. He carried no arrogance, no triumph, only the same calm that had broken her in the arena. She expected ridicule, some gloating claim to her humiliation, but instead his words were steady, deliberate. Strength is not dying for pride. Strength is living when everything tells you to fall. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any philosophy she had been taught. Her people had always believed that honor was worth more than breath. But looking at him, at the way his body bore the marks of countless battles survived, she felt the frailty of that belief. He had endured not because of tradition but because of will. He had carved his path through suffering, not ceremony. The contrast was unbearable and undeniable. Her voice cracked when she asked, "Why deny me death?" He studied her, his gaze unwavering. "Because death teaches nothing. Living with defeat teaches everything." His words sank into her, heavy and unrelenting. She wanted to reject them, to scream against them, yet they coiled inside her until they were impossible to dismiss. For the first time, she saw her culture from the outside. Endless cycles of duels, of warriors throwing themselves into graves for pride, of families celebrating death as proof of worth. Yet what had it brought them? Stagnation, arrogance, a brittle strength that shattered under the pressure of something it could not define. He had proven that. In sparing her, he had shattered not just her honor, but the very foundation of her people's truth. Humiliation lingered, sharp and raw, but alongside it was something she had never known before. Curiosity. What else had her kind blinded themselves to? What else had humans discovered in their will to endure? The more she tried to hate him, the more that dangerous seed grew, twisting her shame into something unrecognizable. She remembered the touch of his hand pressing her down before the crowd, the silent command that bent her without a word. It should have been unbearable, yet when she closed her eyes, the memory stirred not only fury but a strange heat she could not name. He had taken everything from her, and yet part of her longed to feel the weight of that control again. She despised the thought, but it clung to her with the persistence of breath itself. Whispers had already begun to spread beyond the palace. Some called her corrupted, others whispered of human sorcery, still others claimed she had willingly offered herself. The truth mattered less than the spectacle. Her people's faith in their unshakable traditions had cracked. For centuries they had believed themselves untouchable. Now the image of their princess on her knees before a human spread like wildfire, a symbol of something they could neither explain nor deny. She felt the judgment of every eye, yet the man before her seemed unmoved by it all. His calm was unbreakable, his silence more commanding than the loudest roar. When he finally spoke again, his words carried the weight of inevitability. "You are mine because you chose to live. That choice is power, not weakness." The statement crushed her and freed her in equal measure. To belong to another was the deepest disgrace, yet to carry on breathing when her world demanded death was a victory she could not ignore. In the privacy of his presence, the tension between them deepened. What began as humiliation became something else, a bond forged not by choice but by surrender. Her body had been promised as the price of her life, and though shame burned in every touch, a part of her surrendered not only from fear but from desire. His strength, his restraint, his refusal to follow her rules, these drew her like gravity. Every moment with him unraveled another thread of the tapestry she had been wrapped in since birth. She began to question whether her ancestors had been strong or simply blind, whether their endless deaths had built greatness or chained them to an illusion. In his arms she found no honor, no tradition, only the raw truth of existence, survival, connection, the undeniable power of choice. By sparing her, he had not only broken her, but remade her. The humiliation that had once hollowed her now served as the foundation for something terrifying and new. She no longer knew if she belonged to her people or to the man who had defeated her, but she knew with certainty that she could never return to who she had been. The Empire would never forgive. Her father would never accept. Her people would carry her disgrace like a wound. But beneath that shame lay a truth that could not be silenced. The human had shown her a strength beyond honor, beyond death, beyond every tradition that bound her. It was not a lesson she could discard. As the night deepened and she lay restless, torn between pride and surrender, his words echoed once more in her mind. Living with defeat teaches everything. And though it burned her soul to admit it, she understood. He had conquered her blade, her body, her will, and through that conquest he had revealed a power her world had never known. The duel had ended, but the true battle was only beginning. The struggle within her, the rebellion against her people's truths, the dangerous bond between conqueror and conquered. A bond forbidden, humiliating, undeniable. And as the weight of her choices pressed down on her, she knew one thing with clarity. The human had not simply spared her life. He had claimed it, reshaped it, and in doing so, altered the destiny of an empire.